Have you ever tried to watch a 3D movie without the glasses on? The images are fuzzy, distorted, and hard to follow. But the moment you put the glasses on, boom, everything comes into focus. You can see depth, perspective, and complexity that just wasn't there before. Understanding global politics works in the same way. If you try to explain why countries go to war, why alliances form, or why crises escalate without the right tools, it can all feel like a blur. But once you start using what we call the levels of analysis, the picture becomes a whole lot clearer. Hey everyone, and welcome back. I'm Noah Zerbe. I'm a professor of international relations at California State Polytechnic University Humboldt. And in this video, we're exploring one of the most important tools we use in international relations, the levels of analysis. This simple but powerful framework helps us understand the why behind world events by examining them from distinct angles, the individual, domestic, and international levels. Let's take a look at how they work and why they matter. One of the biggest challenges in studying international relations is trying to figure out where to start. If we want to understand why a war started or why an alliance broke down, we need to ask, where do the causes lie? In a leader's personality, in domestic politics, in the global system? These are where the levels of analysis come in. Think of them as different layers of explanation, each offering a distinct perspective on international events. For this course, we'll use the three-level model. The individual level focuses on people, especially decision makers. The domestic level, or state level, which focuses on political systems, institutions, and internal pressures. And the international, or systemic level, which focuses on how countries relate to one another in a global system. To see how the levels of analysis works in practice, let's apply it to a classic case, the First World War. Fought from 1914 to 1918, World War I pitted the Central Powers led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria against the Triple Entente led by Britain, France, and Russia, with the United States joining later. It was one of the deadliest conflicts in modern history. It marked the first time that industrial technology, machine guns, tanks, poison gas, airplanes, were used on a massive scale in a global war. More than 16 million people died, and over 40 countries were drawn into the fighting. But what caused the war? Even today, historians and political scientists debate the answer. And that's where the levels of analysis can help us make sense of this complex and tragic world event. At the individual level, many scholars focus on the personality and leadership of Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. He was famously insecure and erratic, obsessed with military glory, but prone to impulsive decisions and diplomatic missteps. Some historians argue that Wilhelm's psychological makeup and poor judgment contributed to Germany's aggressive foreign policy and deteriorating relationships with other great powers. We might also consider the decision-making styles of other leaders, like Austria-Hungary's Franz Joseph or Russia's Tsar Nicholas II, whose choices during the July crisis help escalate a regional dispute into a global conflict. At this level, we're asking, did flawed individuals misread signals, ignore warnings, or act irrationally in ways that pushed Europe towards war? Could different leaders have changed the outcome? Zooming out, we can consider the domestic political structures of the time. Germany and Austria-Hungary were not fully democratic. Their governments were dominated by militaries, aristocrats, and elites, groups with vested interests in expansion, national pride, and preserving authoritarian rule. There were few checks on executive power, and parliaments had limited authority. In this view, the internal dynamics of these states, militarism, nationalism, elite-driven politics, made war more likely. Ruling coalitions often saw military confrontation as a way to shore up domestic political support or distract from internal unrest. Russia and France faced similar internal pressures, while in Britain and the United States, shifting public attitudes towards European alliances played a role. At the domestic level, we're asking, how did national institutions, ideologies, interest groups, and public sentiment shape the choices made? Finally, the international level focuses on the structure of the global system itself. By 1914, Europe had become a tightly interconnected web of alliances. The Triple Entente and the Central Powers stood locked in a tense standoff. The international system lacked a central authority, so any conflict had the potential to escalate rapidly in an environment of anarchy. The balance of power was unstable. Germany was rising quickly, and many felt that war was inevitable, better sooner than later. Arms races and military mobilization plans like Germany's Schifflin Plan, which called for a quick and decisive attack against France to enable a more protracted war against Russia, as well as the fear of being caught unprepared, created what some scholars called a cult of the offensive. So at this level, we're essentially asking if the very structure of international relations, anarchy, power rivalries, arms races, prevailing military strategies, made the war unavoidable, constraining the choices available to individual actors and affecting domestic politics. Each level of analysis gives us a different lens, but let's pause and define each level a bit more clearly. First, we have the individual level. This level focuses on the role of individuals as actors on the international stage. It's the human dimension, where we consider a leader's personalities, perceptions, and decision-making styles, cognitive biases, emotions, and even miscommunication. This level can also include public opinion or mass movements that influence foreign policy. At the individual level, we're usually looking at national leaders like presidents, leaders of multinational corporations, or intergovernmental organizations. But this level also considers the degree of citizen participation and popular support for a government's action. In general, at this level, we're interested in how the individual characteristics affect the issue we're analyzing. How, in other words, do the personality, perceptions, choices, or activities of key individuals lead to particular outcomes? At the domestic level, we're interested in what's happening inside the country. Is it a democracy or dictatorship? What interest groups are most powerful? Military, business, religion, or something else? What cultural or ideological forces are shaping decisions? Scholars sometimes split this level into the state level, which focuses on political institutions and regime types, and the bureaucratic level, which considers how internal organizations and rivalries shape policy. But for our purposes, we'll treat them as a single level. Finally, the international or systemic level zooms out to look at the structure of the global system. How is power distributed? Is the international system unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar? Are international organizations strong or weak? What are the dominant norms or patterns of behaviors among states? Some frameworks at a global level, focusing on transnational issues like climate change, pandemics, or economic globalization. But in this class, we can group those system effects into the international level. Now, while we tend to view the various levels as distinct, we can and often do move back and forth between the various levels in seeking to explain major international events. Let's apply the levels again, this time to the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 to see how. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq with the official goal of deposing Saddam Hussein and establishing democracy in the country. While the United States initially pressed the United Nations Security Council to authorize the interventions, as it had done in the case of Afghanistan, the Security Council declined to do so. Nevertheless, President George W. Bush authorized the invasion, claiming that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and that it had provided material support for al-Qaeda. Both of these claims later proved to be false. At the individual level, we can understand the push for war as a function of the personalities involved, in some ways even as a struggle between Bush and Hussein. In this analysis, President George W. Bush's personal convictions and those of his key advisors like Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld shaped the decision to go to war. Some argue that President Bush wanted revenge after his father's failure to remove Hussein from power or to establish his personal legacy by reshaping the Middle East. Others argued that Saddam Hussein acted irrationally and fundamentally miscalculated U.S. goals, believing he could deter an invasion and refuse to yield to U.S. demands. These explanations are all rooted in the individual level. The domestic level might focus on the widespread post-9/11 public fear that influenced American perceptions of the world and fueled a more hawkish policy discourse in Washington. Oil interests, defense contractors, and ideological movements might also have played a role, particularly given Vice President Dick Cheney's longstanding connections to the industry. U.S. oil companies were interested in securing access to Iraqi oil supplies, which had been off limits both due to international sanctions and preferences by the Iraqi government to sell oil via non-U.S. suppliers. And the Bush administration framed the war as a necessary for U.S. national security. Claims by the Bush administration that Hussein had an extensive chemical and biological weapons program and that he was pushing to develop nuclear weapons as well raised U.S. national security concerns, and allegations that the Hussein government was providing support for al-Qaeda and the Taliban, all of which turned out to be false, framed the war as a military necessity. These are all explanations rooted at the domestic level. Finally, at the international level, the US stood at the peak of its post-Cold War dominance. Some argued that the invasion was intended to send a message about American hegemony and resolve, even as critics saw it as a challenge to international norms. Again, no one explanation fully captures the event, but each adds a level of crucial context. So let's come back to that 3D glasses analogy. Trying to understand international events without using the levels of analysis is like trying to watch a 3D movie without the glasses. You might see some things, but you'll miss the full picture. Put the glasses on, though, and suddenly the actions of individuals, the politics within states, and the structure of the international system come into focus. You start seeing not just what's happening, but you'll also start to understand why. As we move forward through the course, I encourage you to use this framework in your own analysis, whether it's a breaking news story, a historical case, a simulation exercise. Ask yourself what's happening at the individual level, what domestic factors are shaping events, and what's going on at the international system level. By thinking across the levels, you'll gain deeper insights and a sharper, clearer understanding of global politics.